He watched her wagon disappear into the snow and realized the one thing he couldn't afford to lose had already left. Mason's horse skidded through the frozen road as the last light of day bled across the Wyoming valley. His chest burned in the cold air. Ahead, a lone wagon rattled over the snow, its wheels groaning, its lantern swinging in the wind. Behind him, Pine Ridge Ranch sat silent for the first time in months. Then Delilah turned and saw him riding hard through the drifting snow, and something happened that made him pull sharply on the reins. If stories of love, courage, and second chances speak to you, stay with us and share where you're watching from. The storm rolled down from the Wyoming mountains like a living thing. Snow swept across the canyon trail in thick white waves. Pine trees bent beneath the wind. The sky had disappeared hours ago. Mason Turner pulled his coat tighter and urged his horse forward. He should have been back at Pine Ridge Ranch before dark. Instead, he was searching for two missing calves that had broken away from the herd before the storm arrived. Then he saw it. A wagon, half overturned against a drift, one wheel shattered, the canvas cover torn loose and snapping wildly in the wind. Mason dismounted immediately. His boots sank deep into the snow as he moved toward it. At first he thought nobody could have survived. Then he noticed a hand. Small, still, half buried beneath snow. His jaw tightened. Without a word, he dropped to one knee and cleared the snow away. A woman, young, barely conscious. Dark curls frozen against her cheeks. Her skin had lost nearly all color from the cold. He pressed two fingers against her neck. A pulse. Weak, but there. For a moment, he simply stared. 6 years earlier, he had carried another body through a winter storm. That memory arrived fast and sharp. He shoved it away. This woman was alive. That was all that mattered. An hour later, Pine Ridge Ranch appeared through the snow. Light glowed from the ranch house windows. Ben Harper came running from the barn as Mason carried the woman inside. "Who is she?" "Don't know." "Is she hurt?" "Mostly frozen." That was all Mason said. The woman spent 2 days drifting in and out of sleep in the small guest room near the kitchen. On the third morning, she finally opened her eyes. The room was quiet except for the crackle of firewood in the stove. A mug of coffee sat untouched on the table beside her bed. When she pushed herself upright, the door opened. Mason stepped inside. Tall, broad-shouldered, reserved. The kind of man who looked as though silence fit him better than conversation. "You're awake," he said. She nodded. "My name is Delilah Brooks." Mason acknowledged it with a slight movement of his head. "I found your wagon." "Thank you." The words came naturally. She expected nothing more than simple conversation. Instead, Mason reached into his coat pocket and placed several folded bills on the table. The gesture caught her completely off guard. "What is this?" "Enough money to get wherever you're headed." She stared at him. "The roads are still closed." "They'll open soon." "And then?" His eyes shifted briefly toward the window. "Then you should leave." The room went still. Delilah looked at the money, then back at him. Most people would have offered sympathy, a meal, a welcome. Mason offered distance. She lifted her chin. "Do I owe you something?" "No." "Then why are you trying to get rid of me?" His expression never changed. "I prefer things simple." Delilah let out a slow breath. The answer irritated her more than if he had insulted her. She pushed the money back across the table. "I didn't ask for charity." A flicker crossed his face. Gone almost immediately. "Keep it anyway." Then he turned and left. That afternoon, Delilah learned the nearest boarding house in Dry Willow refused to take her in. The roads remained blocked by snow. The storm had trapped everyone where they already were. By evening, Reverend Samuel Whitaker arrived at the ranch. An hour later, Mason reluctantly agreed to let her stay in an unused bunkhouse behind the barn until travel became possible. No welcome, no smile, only necessity. That night, Delilah sat beside the small bunkhouse window, watching snow gather against the fence posts. Voices drifted from outside. Two ranch hands talking as they walked past. "She ain't the reason he's cold." "Course she ain't." "Man never came back right after Clara and the baby died." The voices faded. Delilah remained still, looking into the darkness. For the first time since arriving at Pine Ridge Ranch, she understood something. Mason Turner had not pushed her away because of who she was. He had pushed her away because somewhere inside that large, silent ranch house, part of him was still standing beside a grave in the snow. And that kind of loneliness was far older than she had imagined. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, not a comfortable one, just a rhythm. The storm finally passed, leaving Ruby Creek buried beneath fresh snow. The roads remained difficult. Wagons moved slowly. Supply deliveries arrived late. Most people stayed close to their stoves and hoped for warmer weather. Delilah kept to herself. She rose early each morning before sunrise. By the time the ranch hands entered the kitchen, coffee was already warming beside the stove. Fresh biscuits sat beneath a clean towel. Nobody had asked her to do it. Nobody thanked her either. That suited her just fine. The bunkhouse was cold at night, but she never complained. Instead, she found things that needed fixing. A torn blanket hanging near the bunk room, a loose cabinet hinge, a broken inventory ledger nobody had updated properly in months. One afternoon, she sat at the long kitchen table sorting supply records while snow drifted against the windows. Flour, salt, coffee beans, lamp oil, nails. The numbers didn't match. Not all of them. She made a small note on a scrap piece of paper and slipped it into her pocket. Outside, life continued. Mason spent most days riding fence lines or checking cattle. He rarely spoke more than necessary. But he noticed things. The kitchen stayed cleaner. The old ranch dog, Scout, suddenly abandoned everyone else and followed Delilah from building to building. Ben Harper laughed about it one morning. "That dog ignored me for 3 years." Scout was lying beneath Delilah's chair at the time. The dog's tail thumped once against the floorboards. Delilah smiled without looking up from her work. Maybe he finally improved his standards. Ben nearly choked on his coffee. The sound of laughter filled the room. A small sound, but it lingered. Mason happened to be standing in the doorway. He paused, only for a second, then continued on his way. That evening, he found himself noticing something strange. The ranch house no longer sounded empty. A chair moved in another room. A kettle whistled. Someone hummed softly while washing dishes. Nothing important. Yet the silence he had lived with for years seemed less absolute, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. A week later, Ben came into the yard looking worried. His mother had fallen ill again. The medicine from Dry Willow's doctor cost more than he had. Mason offered to advance part of his wages. Ben thanked him and left for town. The matter seemed settled. 2 days later, Mason discovered it wasn't. He was reviewing payroll notes when he noticed a missing amount. Not large, just enough. He found Ben in the barn. "You borrow money somewhere else?" Ben hesitated, then nodded. "Miss Brooks helped." Mason frowned. "Delilah?" Ben looked uncomfortable. "She said not to mention it." Mason said nothing. Later that evening, he watched Delilah from across the kitchen. She was mending a work shirt beside the stove. The lamp cast a warm circle of light around her. She never looked up, never tried to draw attention to herself. And for the first time, Mason realized she had been helping people around the ranch without expecting anything in return. Something shifted. only slightly. But enough. Then trouble arrived. It happened after midnight. The wind had picked up again. A horse suddenly began screaming from the pasture. Moments later, another answered. Then another. Mason was out of bed instantly, lantern in one hand, rifle in the other. By the time he reached the yard, Ben was already running from the bunkhouse. They followed the noise toward the north fence. Their lanterns bounced across the darkness. Then Mason saw it. The fence had been cut, not broken. Cut. Wire hung loose against the snow. Beyond it, dozens of cattle were moving toward a frozen ravine hidden beneath darkness and drifting snow. One wrong step, one panic, and half the herd could be lost before morning. Mason's jaw tightened. Someone had done this deliberately. Behind him, boots crunched across the snow. Delilah had followed the commotion from the ranch house. She stood beside the lantern light, staring at the damaged fence. Nobody spoke. The cold wind swept across the open land, and somewhere beyond the darkness, whoever had done this was already gone. For the first time since Delilah arrived at Pine Ridge Ranch, the danger facing the ranch felt larger than bad weather or bad luck. Someone wanted harm done, and someone had just made their first move. The next morning dawned gray and bitter cold. The damaged fence had been repaired before sunrise. Mason, Ben, and two ranch hands worked by lantern light while frost coated their gloves and collars. Nobody spoke much. There wasn't much to say. A fence did not cut itself. After breakfast, Mason saddled his horse and rode the northern boundary, then the southern, then the eastern. By sunset, he found nothing. No tracks, no clues, just snow and silence. The kind of silence that made a man uneasy. The days that followed brought more trouble. A sack of feed disappeared from storage. One of the water troughs was found damaged. Nothing catastrophic. Just enough to wear down a person's patience. Just enough to remind them someone was watching. Delilah noticed something else. Every problem cost money. Every repair. Every missing supply. Every delay. One evening she sat at the kitchen table surrounded by account books. The lamp burned low beside her. Columns of numbers stretched across yellowed pages. She ran her finger down one entry, then another. Something wasn't right. The losses were real, but the ranch's finances looked worse than they should. She folded a corner of paper and slipped it into the ledger. A note for later. When she finally looked up, Mason was standing near the stove. He had entered quietly, as usual. "You still working?" She glanced toward the clock, nearly 10. "I lost track of time." His eyes moved toward the open books. "Find anything?" The question surprised her. It was the first time he had asked for her opinion. "Maybe." He waited. She noticed he did that often. He rarely interrupted, rarely filled silence with unnecessary words. "If I'm right," she said, "someone's charging interest on an old loan that should have been reduced years ago." Mason frowned. "I don't handle bank papers." "I can tell." A faint smile tugged at one corner of her mouth. For a second, she thought she saw the same thing threaten to appear on his face. Then it vanished. The next week, winter tightened around Ruby Creek. Temperatures dropped further. Snow piled against fences. The mountains disappeared behind white clouds. One afternoon, Mason asked Delilah to accompany him while checking a remote grazing section near Miller Ridge. It wasn't a request he would have made a month earlier. Neither of them mentioned that. The sky looked clear when they left. By noon, it had changed. Dark clouds rolled over the mountains. The wind rose fast. A blizzard. Mason saw it coming too late. "We need shelter." There was an old trapping cabin half a mile ahead. They reached it just as the storm swallowed the landscape. The cabin was small. One room, one stove, one narrow window. The roof creaked beneath the wind. Snow rattled against the walls. Inside, they sat across from each other while a small fire struggled inside the iron stove. Hours passed. Neither seemed eager to speak, yet neither seemed uncomfortable either. The silence felt different now, less like distance, more like company. Near midnight, Mason finally broke it. "My wife died during a winter fever." The words came quietly, as though they had traveled a long distance before reaching the room. Delilah looked at him. He stared into the fire. "Our son died 3 days later." The flames shifted. A log cracked softly. Mason said nothing else. He didn't need to. The grief was still there. Not loud, just permanent. After a while, Delilah spoke. She told him about Missouri, about the freight company, about the missing funds she reported, about being blamed when powerful men needed someone convenient to blame. Mason listened. No pity, no speeches, only understanding. When dawn arrived, the storm finally weakened. They rode home through fresh snow beneath a pale winter sky. Something had changed. Neither named it. Back at Pine Ridge Ranch, Abigail Turner noticed it immediately. Her brother listened when Delilah spoke. He lingered in doorways. He looked toward the kitchen when he returned from town. Once Abigail caught him smiling at something Delilah said to Ben. The expression disappeared so quickly he probably thought nobody saw it. But she did. A week later, Delilah was sorting old documents in the ranch office. Dust covered most of them. Loan records, receipts, property filings, documents Mason's late father had stored years earlier. Then she found it. A contract. Old. Folded deep inside a drawer. Her eyes narrowed. She read it once. Then again. The language was complicated. Legal. Carefully written. But the meaning became clear. If certain payments were delayed, ownership rights could gradually transfer to the Dry Willow Bank. Not immediately. Quietly. Piece by piece. Through hidden clauses buried in the paperwork. Delilah sat very still. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the snow. The realization settled heavily inside her. Pine Ridge Ranch was in danger, and Mason had no idea. She grabbed the documents and hurried toward the main house. Then a shout echoed across the property. A ranch hand running from the western field. Another voice answered. Urgent. Panicked. Delilah stepped outside. A column of black smoke rose into the winter sky, straight above one of the hay barns. For one frozen second, nobody moved. Then the alarm bell began ringing across Pine Ridge Ranch. Men came running from every direction. Buckets appeared. Lanterns swung through the darkness. The western hay barn was already burning. Orange light flashed against the snow-covered ground, while sparks climbed into the winter sky. Mason reached the barn first. 2 frightened horses were still trapped inside. "Open the rear gate," he shouted. Ben and 2 ranch hands rushed toward the side entrance. Smoke rolled through the rafters. The horses kicked wildly against their stalls. Without hesitation, Mason disappeared into the building. Delilah felt her stomach tighten. The heat hit even from outside. A moment later, one horse burst through the doorway. Then another. The men pulled them clear. For an instant, it looked as though everyone would make it out safely. Then part of the roof gave way. A heavy beam crashed down inside the barn. Several men shouted at once. "Mason!" The fire continued roaring. Seconds later, he emerged through the smoke, stumbling into the snow. Ben reached him first. Mason was conscious. Barely. His coat sleeve had been torn. A deep bruise darkened one side of his face. By midnight, the fire was finally under control. Half the barn was gone. The smell of wet ash lingered over the ranch. Mason spent the next several days confined to the house. The local doctor from Dry Willow examined him and ordered complete rest. Mason ignored the advice, at least until the fever arrived. Then even he could not fight it. The injury itself was not severe, but exhaustion and winter exposure caught up with him. For 3 days he drifted in and out of sleep. Delilah rarely left the room. She changed cool cloths, measured medicine, kept fresh water beside the bed. At night she slept in a wooden chair near the window. The lamp burned low beside her. Outside, gossip traveled quickly through Dry Willow. People noticed. People always noticed. Delilah paid them no attention. Neither did Abigail. On the 4th evening, Mason opened his eyes and found Delilah asleep beside the chair. An open ledger rested across her lap. Several pages were covered with notes. His gaze lingered there, then on her. For reasons he could not fully explain, the room felt calmer whenever she was in it. During the fever, he sometimes reached out without realizing it. Once he whispered Clara's name, the name of the wife he had buried. Delilah lowered her eyes and simply adjusted the blanket. The next night, he reached for her hand again. This time, another name escaped him. Delilah. Softly, almost uncertainly. She said nothing, but she did not pull away. Meanwhile, the investigation continued. The loan documents she had discovered led to more questions. Ben Harper helped search old storage trunks, filing cabinets, and account books. Together, they found copies of property transfers involving neighboring ranches. The same signatures appeared again and again. The same bank. The same witnesses. The same sheriff. One snowy afternoon, the pieces finally connected. Ezra Kane, Sheriff Curtis Doyle. Years of questionable land seizures. Years of ranch owners losing property they never fully understood they had signed away. Delilah carefully gathered every document, every receipt, every note. The evidence was finally beginning to take shape, which was exactly when trouble arrived. 2 deputies rode into Pine Ridge Ranch just after sunrise. Delilah was carrying a box of records into the house when they dismounted. Sheriff Doyle stepped down behind them. His expression remained calm, professional, almost friendly. "Miss Brooks," he said, "I'll need those documents." Delilah's grip tightened slightly. "Why?" Doyle removed a folded warrant. "You're being charged with theft of bank property and falsifying financial records." Silence settled over the yard. Ben stared in disbelief. Abigail stepped forward immediately. "This is ridiculous." Doyle ignored her. The deputies took the box. Then Delilah. Within the hour, she was sitting alone inside the Dry Willow jail. Iron bars, wooden desk, a small stove burning in the corner. Outside, snow drifted past the window. The cell door opened again before sunset. Heavy footsteps crossed the room. Delilah looked up. Mason Turner stood there, still pale from the fever, still recovering, but standing. For the first time since she had arrived in Wyoming, there was no distance in his eyes, only anger. Sheriff Doyle appeared from the adjoining office. "Mason, this doesn't concern—" "Yes," Mason interrupted quietly. "It does." The entire room went silent, and for the first time, Mason Turner openly stood against the most powerful lawman in Dry Willow. Sheriff Curtis Doyle folded his arms. "You should go home, Mason." "No." The answer came quietly. That was what made it land so hard. People in Dry Willow were used to seeing Mason avoid conflict whenever possible. He handled cattle, storms, and broken fences. He left politics to other men. Not this time. Delilah stood behind the bars and watched him. His face was still pale from the fever. His right hand trembled slightly from exhaustion. Yet he did not move. "I want to see the warrant," Mason said. Doyle hesitated, only for a second. But Mason saw it. So did Reverend Samuel Whitaker, who had just stepped through the jailhouse door. By sunset, half the town had heard about the arrest. By sunrise, the other half had heard Mason Turner was fighting it. The next several days changed everything. Abigail opened old family records. Ben Harper rode to neighboring ranches, gathering statements from families who had lost land under strange circumstances. Reverend Whitaker wrote letters to territorial offices in Cheyenne. And Delilah's documents kept leading to the same names, the same signatures, the same witnesses, the same bank, the same sheriff. 3 days later, a territorial investigator arrived by train. His name was Walter Grayson. He carried a leather case full of official papers and the kind of patience that made dishonest men uncomfortable. The investigation moved quickly. Too quickly for Ezra Kane. Old records were compared, signatures examined, witnesses questioned. One rancher after another stepped forward. A widow from Elk Crossing, a cattleman from North Ridge, a retired blacksmith who had nearly lost everything 10 years earlier. The stories matched, the patterns matched, and eventually the evidence matched too. By the end of the week, Ezra Kane sat alone inside his bank office while investigators carried out boxes of records. Sheriff Doyle no longer wore his badge. Neither man said much. There was nothing left to say. The truth had finally caught up with them. When the ruling arrived, Pine Ridge Ranch was declared free of all disputed claims. The hidden clauses were void. The fraudulent transfers were overturned. The land belonged to Mason, completely. The valley celebrated. Church bells rang on Sunday. Neighbors stopped by with pies and fresh bread. Children ran through the ranch yard while adults talked beneath the winter sun. For the first time in months, the future felt secure. But Delilah had already made her decision. The letter arrived from Colorado on a Thursday morning. A trading company in Denver had offered her a bookkeeping position. Steady work, good pay, a chance to build something entirely her own. She accepted. Mason found out 3 days later. He nodded once when she told him, asked practical questions, said all the things a reasonable man should say, nothing more. The wagon was loaded before sunrise. 1 trunk, 2 boxes, a small carpet bag. The same dog that had followed her for months sat beside the gate and refused to move. Delilah smiled and scratched behind his ears. "You'll be fine." The dog seemed unconvinced. Mason helped secure the last trunk. The snow beneath his boots creaked softly. Neither spoke much. The valley stretched white and quiet around them. Finally, Delilah climbed onto the wagon seat. "Take care of yourself." "You too." That was all. Then she gathered the reins. The wagon rolled down the road, past the gate, past the cottonwood trees, past the rise overlooking the ranch. And then she was gone. Mason stood there for a long time, long after the sound of wheels disappeared, long after everyone else returned to their work. That evening, the ranch house felt different. The kitchen sat empty. No lamp glowed over account books. No fresh bread cooled beside the window. No quiet footsteps crossed the floor. Scout waited beside the front door until after dark, then moved to the gate, still waiting. Mason sat alone on the porch. The mountains stood silent beneath the fading sunset. For years he had believed losing land would be the worst thing that could happen. Then he thought losing the ranch would destroy him. Now both were safe, and somehow none of it mattered, because the one person who had made the house feel alive was gone. The realization settled over him slowly. Not the ranch, not the cattle, not the bank, her. He stood so quickly the chair rocked backward. Within minutes he was saddling his horse. The winter air burned cold against his face as he rode. The road wound across the valley. Snow drifted along the fences. The sun hung low over the mountains. Several miles later, he spotted the wagon. Delilah heard hoofbeats and turned. Mason pulled alongside and stopped. For a moment, neither spoke. The horse breathed heavily. The wagon creaked softly. The valley waited. Finally, Mason looked at her. Really looked at her. "The day I told you to leave," he said, "was the worst decision I ever made." Nothing grand. Nothing rehearsed. Just the truth. Delilah studied him for a long moment. Then she climbed down from the wagon. 1 year later, Pine Ridge Ranch looked different. The barns had been rebuilt. The books balanced perfectly. The fences stood straight. Children from neighboring ranches gathered for church socials and harvest dinners. Laughter drifted from the house almost every evening. As the sun settled behind the Wyoming hills, Mason and Delilah sat together on the same porch where he had once watched her leave. The air smelled faintly of pine smoke and fresh coffee. Below them, the ranch stretched across the valley in long bands of gold light. Neither of them said much. They didn't need to. The ranch survived. The land remained. But the true victory was simpler than any deed or contract. The woman he rejected had become the home he never knew he needed. And maybe that's why stories like this stay with us long after they end. Because if we're honest, most of us have had a season in life when we built walls the way Mason did. Maybe not around a ranch in Wyoming. Maybe not after a winter storm. But around our hearts, around our hopes, around the parts of ourselves that had been hurt before. Imagine standing on that porch as the sun slips behind the mountains. The land is finally safe. The battles are over. Yet the one thing that truly matters is already rolling away down the road. Would you recognize it in time? Would you find the courage to go after it? What stays with me is not the conspiracy or the struggle for the ranch. It's the quiet truth underneath it all. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive with a grand speech. Sometimes it shows up as a person who keeps showing kindness when the world has given them every reason not to. And sometimes a second chance comes disguised as an ordinary day, asking only that we open the door instead of closing it. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know. What moment touched your heart the most? And if you enjoy stories about resilience, unexpected love, and the people who help us find our way back to ourselves, I hope you'll stay a little longer. There are more journeys waiting just down the trail, and I'd be honored to share the next one with you.